A mechanic fixes a disabled girl's wheelchair for free, not knowing that her single billionaire mom is watching. But when the little girl's mom steps forward, the mechanic's whole world changes. This isn't just any woman. She's a tech mogul with a secret past and a heart full of pain. How will he react when he learns who she really is? And what happens when their worlds collide in ways neither of them ever expected? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The black SUV wound its way through the mountain roads like a careful shadow, its headlights cutting through the deepening purple of dusk. Ava Lockhart's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter with each curve, her knuckles white against the black leather. The dashboard clock read 7:42 p.m., and the GPS screen blinked steadily. Marlow Ridge, 12 miles. In the rearview mirror, she caught glimpses of Lila, sound asleep in her specially modified car seat. Her daughter's chest rose and fell peacefully, pink headphones slightly askew on her head, and her beloved stuffed astronaut, Major Tom, tucked securely under one arm. The sight made Ava's throat tight. Even in sleep, Lila's face held that hint of determination that always reminded Ava of herself. The trees pressed close to the road, their branches reaching over like protective arms. As they rounded another bend, a weathered wooden sign appeared in the headlights. Welcome to Marlow Ridge. Population 1,324. Ava let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The smaller the number, the better. The SUV's tires crunched over fallen pine needles as they made their way up the final stretch. The rental cabin emerged from the darkness, a modest structure of wood and stone that seemed to grow naturally from the mountainside. It wasn't fancy, nothing like their house in the city, but that was exactly the point. "Lila, sweetheart," Ava called softly, turning off the engine. "We're here." Lila stirred, pulling off her headphones with sleepy hands. "Already?" "I was having the best dream about rockets." "Of course you were," Ava smiled, getting out and moving to help Lila with her wheelchair transfer. The routine was second nature now. The careful movements, the supportive holds, the way Lila knew exactly when to shift her weight. They moved together like dancers who'd practiced the same steps 1,000 times. The cabin key was exactly where the rental agent had said it would be, tucked inside a small lockbox by the door. Inside, the space was cozy and clean, smelling of pine and fresh laundry. Ava flicked on the lights, revealing a simple open-plan living area, with a kitchen tucked into one corner. 2 bedrooms branched off from the main space, and thankfully the doorways were wide enough for Lila's chair. While Lila explored the cabin, making excited declarations about every discovery. "Mom, look at all these books! The windows are so big, we'll be able to see the stars!" Ava moved on autopilot. She unpacked their essentials first, Lila's medications, arranged precisely on the kitchen counter, then their toiletries and pajamas. Her phone buzzed for the 100th time that day. The screen lit up with a parade of notifications. Urgent. Call regarding Q3 projections. Meeting with legal team rescheduled. Marcus, CFO, 5 missed calls. Richard's lawyers have requested. Ava's thumb hovered over the power button. The thought of turning it off made her chest feel lighter and heavier at the same time. Instead, she opened her messages and began deleting them in batches, watching the numbers tick down like a countdown to freedom. "Mom?" Lila's voice came from the kitchen doorway. She had Major Tom propped in her lap, his silver suit catching the warm cabin light. "Are we hiding again?" The question hit Ava like a physical thing. She turned to her daughter, taking in the knowing look in those wise eyes. 7 years old, and sometimes Lila seemed to understand everything, even the things Ava tried to protect her from. "Just breathing, baby," Ava answered with a half-smile that felt more genuine than any expression she'd worn in weeks. She moved to kneel beside Lila's chair. "Sometimes we need to go somewhere quiet to remember how." like when the astronauts have to check their oxygen tanks. Exactly like that. Ava touched her nose to Lila's, earning a giggle. They made dinner from the groceries they'd picked up on the way, simple sandwiches and soup from a can, but it felt more like a feast than any of the catered business dinners Ava had attended in the past month. Lila chatted about constellations and space stations, her enthusiasm making the cabin feel warmer somehow. Bedtime was their sacred routine. Ava helped Lila with her nighttime medications, and then her transfer into bed. They read 2 chapters of The Little Prince, Lila's current favorite, and talked about what it would be like to live on a tiny planet with only one rose for company. I'd get lonely, Lila decided, snuggling deeper under the quilted covers. I'd want you there too. Then I'd have to come visit in a rocket ship, Ava said, tucking the blanket around Lila's shoulders. Promise? Cross my heart and hope to fly. After one last kiss goodnight, Ava stood at the bedroom window, watching the trees sway in the mountain breeze. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the forest floor. In the glass, she could see her reflection and the glint of her wedding ring. Without ceremony, Ava slipped the ring from her finger. The tan line beneath it stood out starkly against her skin, but the weight of its absence felt right. She opened the drawer of the bedside table and placed the ring inside, closing it with a soft but final click. Moving to the living room, Ava took her phone from her pocket. She looked at the screen one last time. Another missed call from Marcus, 2 emails from the board, a text from her sister asking if she was okay. With a deep breath, she held down the power button and watched the screen go dark. For now, they were ghosts. No meetings, no lawyers, no shareholders or expectations. Just a mother and daughter, breathing in the quiet of the mountains, letting the world spin on without them for a little while. The next day, the morning sun painted Marlow Ridge in shades of gold, turning the mountain air crisp and sweet. Ava stood in the kitchen of their rental cabin, making a list of essentials they'd need while Lila finished her breakfast. The cabin's pantry had only the basics: salt, pepper, and a few forgotten tea bags left by previous guests. "Ready for our first expedition?" Ava asked, tucking the list into her purse. Lila beamed, carefully placing her empty cereal bowl in the sink. Mission control is go for launch. The drive into town took less than 10 minutes, the narrow road opening up into a modest main street lined with brick buildings that looked like they belonged on an old postcard. Morton's General Store sat at the corner, its green awning faded but cheerful in the morning light. The store's entrance had a gently sloping ramp, and Ava silently thanked whoever had thought to install it. Inside, the wooden floors creaked welcomingly under their feet and Lila's wheels. The aisles were narrow but manageable, and the shelves reached toward a tin ceiling decorated with pressed patterns from another era. Lila took charge of their shopping mission, directing Ava to each item on their list with the seriousness of a NASA flight director. "Mom, we need milk for the coffee. You're always grumpy without coffee," she declared, making the elderly cashier chuckle from her perch behind the counter. They filled their basket with the necessities: bread, eggs, fruit, and enough snacks to last them through the week. Lila convinced Ava to add a package of cookies shaped like stars, arguing that they were technically educational because they could use them to make constellation patterns. The morning had warmed considerably by the time they emerged from the store, their paper bags filled with groceries. Ava balanced the bags carefully while helping Lila navigate the entrance. Everything seemed fine until they reached the parking area, where gravel had spilled across the concrete path. There was a sudden jolt, and Lila's chair lurched to one side. "Mom!" Lila called out, more surprised than scared. "I think something's wrong with my wheel." Ava set the groceries down and knelt to inspect the chair. The small front wheel on the right side had come loose, hanging at an awkward angle that made the chair impossible to maneuver safely. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sorry. Let me see if I can fix this." "I can help," Lila insisted, leaning forward in her seat. "I know all about mechanical engineering. I read about it in my space books." Despite her mounting frustration, Ava couldn't help but smile at her daughter's enthusiasm. She dug through her purse, finding the small multi-tool she always carried for emergencies like this. But the wheel's mechanism was more complicated than it looked, and her attempts to reattach it only seemed to make things worse. The sun beat down on her neck as she struggled with the tiny screws, acutely aware of how exposed they were on the sidewalk. This was exactly the kind of attention she'd been trying to avoid. Her hands were starting to shake with frustration when a shadow fell across the wheel. "Looks like you folks could use a hand." The voice was deep and gentle, with a hint of gravel that matched the owner's work boots, now visible at the edge of Ava's vision. She looked up, squinting against the sun despite her sunglasses. A tall man stood there, holding a red toolbox that had seen better days. His dark hair was slightly messy, and his gray t-shirt bore the logo Maddox Motors across the chest. There was a smudge of grease on his forearm, and his hands showed the honest wear of someone who worked with them every day. Before Ava could respond, Lila piped up. "Are you a mechanic? Like the ones who fix the rovers on Mars?" The man's serious expression cracked into a warm grin. He crouched down to Lila's eye level, setting his toolbox on the ground. "Something like that. Name's Chris. And who might you be, Rocket?" Lila giggled at the nickname. "I'm Lila, and this is my mom." She gestured to Ava, who was still kneeling by the wheel, her guard up despite the man's friendly demeanor. "Mind if I take a look?" Chris asked, directing the question to both of them. His eyes met Ava's briefly, and she was struck by their clarity. There was no pity there, no uncomfortable awareness of who she might be. Just simple, straightforward offer of help. Ava nodded, moving aside to give him room. Chris opened his toolbox and assessed the damage with practiced efficiency. "Ah, I see the problem. These little guys like to come loose sometimes." He pulled out a specialized wrench and began working on the wheel. "You know, Rocket, with a few modifications, we could probably turn this into a proper Mars rover." Lila's eyes widened with delight. "Really? Could it drive over rocks and everything?" "Well, maybe not everything," Chris chuckled, his hands moving with confident precision. "But we could definitely improve the suspension. That's what helps rovers handle rough terrain on Mars." As he worked, Chris kept up a steady stream of conversation with Lila about space exploration, showing genuine interest in her enthusiasm for the subject. He knew enough about NASA missions to keep up with her questions, and his answers made her laugh with their mix of technical knowledge and silly jokes. Ava watched from behind her sunglasses, something in her chest loosening slightly. She'd grown used to people either ignoring Lila's chair or making too much of it, treating her daughter with awkward sympathy or exaggerated cheerfulness. But Chris spoke to Lila like any other curious kid, his respect for her evident in every interaction. "There we go," Chris announced after a few minutes, giving the wheel a final check. "Good as new, maybe even better. This one's got special Mars dust protection now." He winked at Lila, who beamed back at him. "How much do I owe you?" Ava asked, reaching for her purse. The repair had been quick but skilled, and she was used to paying well for professional services. Chris stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Nah," he said with a casual wave. "She made me laugh. That's worth more than cash." His smile was genuine, touched with something that might have been understanding. He gathered his tools and headed back across the street to his garage, his boots crunching on the gravel. The sign above the garage door read, "Maddox Motors," in faded red letters, and Ava could see the organized chaos of a working mechanic's shop inside. Lila watched him go, her expression full of wonder. "Mom, he knows about Mars rovers," she whispered excitedly, as if sharing a precious secret. Ava found herself watching too, something warm and unexpected stirring in her chest. In the morning sun, Chris's retreating figure cast a long shadow across the street, and his smile lingered in her mind like a promise of simpler things. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's windows, casting warm patches on the wooden floor where Lila sat with her breakfast. She hadn't stopped talking about Chris and his garage since yesterday, her eyes sparkling with excitement over every detail she remembered. "Mom," Lila said, pushing her half-eaten toast aside. "What if my chair needs a turbo boost, like the ones they put on rockets?" Her hands gestured wildly, mimicking an explosion of speed. Ava looked up from her coffee, trying to hide her smile. "Sweetheart, I don't think wheelchairs need turbo boosts." "But what if they do?" Lila persisted, her expression serious. "What if we're missing out on something really important? Chris would know. He knows about Mars rovers." Ava's initial instinct was to say no. They were supposed to be laying low, not making connections. But looking at Lila's hopeful face, she felt her resolve weakening. When was the last time she'd seen her daughter this animated about something that wasn't on a screen? "Please, Mom?" Lila clasped her hands together. "We could just say thank you for fixing my wheel. That's the polite thing to do, right?" Ava sighed, recognizing defeat. "Just for a quick thank you," she agreed, already knowing it probably wouldn't be that simple. They made their way into town, Lila chattering the whole time about mechanical engineering and space travel. The garage came into view, its doors rolled up to welcome the morning air. Chris was already at work, bent over the engine of an old pickup truck. He straightened up when he heard them approach, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "Well, if it isn't mission control," he called out, offering Lila a mock salute that made her giggle. "We brought coffee," Lila announced before Ava could speak. She looked up at her mother. "Well, Mom brought coffee. I'm not allowed to have it yet because it might stunt my growth." Ava felt her cheeks warm slightly as she held up 2 travel mugs. I thought you might like some, as a thank you for yesterday." Chris's smile reached his eyes, creating small crinkles at the corners. "Coffee's always welcome here." He gestured to a workbench he'd clearly just cleared off. "Would the engineer in training like her own station?" Lila's eyes went wide. "My own station? Really?" "Can't have a proper mission without a good setup," Chris replied, helping her position her chair at the bench. He brought over a collection of tools and a clean shop rag. "First lesson in mechanics, keeping your tools clean and organized. Think you can handle that, Rocket?" "Yes, sir," Lila saluted back, already reaching for a wrench with determined focus. Ava found herself perched on a sturdy stool nearby, watching as Chris showed Lila how to properly clean and sort different tools. He explained each one's purpose with patience, throwing in space-related analogies that kept Lila hanging on every word. "This socket wrench," he held up the tool. "It's like the robotic arm on the International Space Station. You've got to be precise with it, but it can handle just about any job." When a customer arrived needing a tire change, Chris turned it into an educational experience. "Want to help me with this mission, Rocket?" he asked Lila, who nodded enthusiastically. Ava watched as Chris guided Lila through the process, letting her hand him tools and explaining each step. He never talked down to her or treated her differently because of her chair. Instead, he found ways to include her that made sense, making her feel like a valuable part of the operation. The morning stretched into afternoon, punctuated by Lila's delighted laughter and the steady sounds of garage work. Ava found herself relaxing despite her initial reservations. She sipped her coffee, occasionally catching Chris's eye when he made a particularly clever joke that had Lila in stitches. During a quiet moment, when Lila was absorbed in polishing a set of wrenches, Chris leaned against the workbench near Ava. He accepted the coffee she'd brought, taking a grateful sip. "This is quite a change from city life," he commented casually, not looking directly at her. "Marlow Ridge moves at its own pace." Ava appreciated that it wasn't really a question. "It's peaceful," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "Sometimes simple is good." Chris nodded, understanding in his silence. He didn't press for details about her past or why they were here. Instead, he shared small observations about life in their little town. The best spots to watch meteor showers, the diner that made incredible apple pie, the way the whole community came together for summer festivals. As the afternoon began to fade into evening, Chris pulled out some blank stickers and markers. "Every good spacecraft needs proper identification," he announced. "What do you say we design something special for your chair, Rocket?" Lila's face lit up as they worked together to create a custom design. Chris's steady hands helped guide the markers where Lila's enthusiasm might have gone off course, and soon they had produced a colorful sticker featuring a rocket ship and the word rocket in bold letters. "This is the best day ever," Lila declared as Chris carefully applied the sticker to her chair. She ran her fingers over it reverently, beaming with pride. Ava watched the scene unfold, something tight in her chest finally unwinding. Lila looked different here, lighter, happier. The constant tension that had shadowed her young face in recent months had melted away, replaced by pure joy. Her daughter's hands were slightly smudged with grease. Her hair had come partially loose from its neat ponytail, and she looked more alive than she had in ages. The setting sun painted the garage in warm, golden light, turning ordinary tools and machinery into something almost magical. Ava looked down at her own hands, noticing a small grease smudge on her finger where she'd helped hold the sticker in place. Somehow, it didn't bother her the way it once might have, like the weight that had lifted from her shoulders, like the smile she couldn't quite hide. It felt like something new, something real. The afternoon sun had been playing hide-and-seek behind gathering clouds when Ava and Lila pulled up to Maddox Motors. Over the past few days, their visits had become almost routine, a fact that both thrilled Lila and quietly unsettled Ava, though not entirely in a bad way. Chris was outside, organizing parts on the storage racks when they arrived. His face brightened at the sight of them, the way it always did. "If it isn't my favorite engineering team," he called out, wiping his hands on his ever-present shop rag. Lila wheeled herself forward eagerly. "I brought my space encyclopedia today. There's this really cool chapter about mechanical systems and zero gravity that I think—" A low rumble of thunder cut through her excitement. Chris glanced up at the darkening sky, his expression shifting to concern. "That's not good," he muttered, already moving toward the outdoor equipment. Storms rolling in fast. Fat raindrops began to fall, scattered at first but quickly gaining momentum. Chris rushed to gather tools and parts from the outdoor racks. Without thinking, Ava jumped in to help, grabbing armfuls of equipment. "The diagnostic computer," Chris called over the increasing downpour. "Can you grab that?" "It's the blue case." Ava spotted it and snatched it up just as the sky seemed to open completely. Rain poured down in sheets, instantly soaking through her light summer blouse. She hurried inside where Chris had already whisked Lila to safety. They stood just inside the garage doors, all three of them dripping wet and slightly out of breath. Chris hit the button to lower the heavy doors, shutting out the worst of the storm. The sudden darkness was broken by another flash of lightning, followed by a boom of thunder that made Lila squeal with delight. "Well," Chris said, running a hand through his wet hair, "guess we're having an impromptu storm party." He moved through the dim garage with familiar ease, clicking on work lights and dragging out an old space heater. The orange glow gave the garage a cozy feel, despite the rain drumming on the metal roof. He tossed them each a clean shop towel. Not exactly spa quality, but they'll help. Lila had already adapted to the situation with characteristic enthusiasm. She'd positioned herself on a clear spot of floor, holding a flashlight under her chin. "Did you know there are theories about alien life forms that exist in storm clouds on Jupiter?" she asked, her face dramatically illuminated. Ava couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising her with its freedom. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been caught in the rain, let alone allowed herself to just be wet. Her carefully maintained appearance was completely undone, hair plastered to her face, makeup probably smeared. But somehow, in the warm glow of the garage, it didn't matter. Jupiter storms can last for hundreds of years, Lila continued, clearly warming to her topic. And some scientists think there might be creatures living in them, swimming through the clouds like fish in the ocean. Now that's properly spooky, Chris said, settling down near them with his own towel draped around his shoulders. His usual confidence seemed softer in the stormlight, more vulnerable somehow. "You know what else is spooky?" he asked, his voice taking on a quieter tone. "Racing motorcycles through rain like this. Used to do it all the time in my motocross days." Lila's eyes widened. "You were a racer? Like, a real one?" "Sure was." Chris smiled, but there was something sad in it. "National circuit and everything. My little brother Jake was my mechanic. Best one I ever had. We were quite a team." The past tense hung heavy in the air. Ava found herself holding her breath, sensing the weight of what was coming. "There was this race," Chris continued, his fingers absently tracing patterns in the condensation on his water bottle. "Storm came up just like this one. Jake insisted on doing one final check on my bike, even though visibility was getting bad." He paused, swallowing hard. "A truck didn't see us on the side of the road. I walked away with a broken arm. Jake didn't walk away at all." The garage was quiet except for the rain. Lila reached out and put her small hand on Chris's arm, showing an emotional wisdom beyond her years. "I couldn't get back on a bike after that," Chris said softly. "Sold everything except this garage Jake and I had started together. Figured fixing things was better than racing them." Ava found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "I understand running from a life that stops making sense." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the intimate space of the storm-darkened garage, it carried. "Yeah?" Chris's eyes met hers, gentle and free of judgment. "I built this empire," she said, the words coming easier in the dark. "Tech company, perfect image, power couple marriage. It looked amazing from the outside. But inside," she shook her head, "it was all cold, empty. My husband cared more about our stock price than our daughter. I lost myself trying to be what everyone expected." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the garage in brief, bright bursts. In those moments, Ava could see Chris's face clearly, the understanding there, the absence of pity she'd grown so used to from others. "The divorce was ugly," she continued, "very public. Everyone had an opinion about it, about me." She glanced at Lila, who had begun to doze off despite her best efforts to stay awake. "We needed space, real space, not the kind you can buy." "Sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to find," Chris said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm and Lila's gentle breathing as she curled up on a padded workbench, finally giving in to sleep. The rain had begun to ease, its rhythm becoming less urgent. In the soft light of the space heater, Chris moved closer to where Ava sat. With gentle fingers, he reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was brief, careful, but it sent warmth spreading through her chest. Ava didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Possibility, potential, peace. After a moment that seemed to stretch like honey, Chris cleared his throat softly. "I've got some dry clothes in the office," he offered, "and my truck's right out back. Let me drive you two home." Ava looked at her sleeping daughter, then back at Chris. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for more than just the offer of clothes and a ride. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter as they gathered their things to leave. The air felt different now, charged with something new and delicate and full of promise. Days later, morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's kitchen window as Ava flipped pancakes on the old cast-iron griddle. The sweet scent of maple syrup and coffee filled the cozy space, mixing with the fresh mountain air drifting in through the screen door. "And then Captain Grease showed me how the spark plugs work," Lila exclaimed from her spot at the wooden table, her hands animated as she described yesterday's adventures. He says they're like tiny lightning bolts that make the engine go vroom. Captain Grease? Ava raised an eyebrow, trying to maintain a neutral expression even as warmth crept into her cheeks. That's quite a nickname you've given him. Well, he always has grease on his hands, Lila explained matter-of-factly, taking a big bite of pancake. But he says it's okay because the best mechanics are the messy ones. They're not afraid to get their hands dirty to fix things properly. Ava turned back to the stove, grateful for the excuse to hide the soft smile that refused to leave her face. She couldn't remember the last time Lila had been this excited about someone new in their lives. Her daughter had always been friendly, but this was different. There was a trust there, an ease that usually took months to develop. "Mom?" Lila's voice took on that tone she used when she was about to suggest something she really wanted. "Could we maybe go back to the garage today? Chris said he had this old cart we could work on together. He thinks we can turn it into a rocket buggy." Ava hesitated, her hand pausing mid-flip with a pancake. She should say no, should create some distance, should remember all the reasons they came here to hide away. But when she turned and saw Lila's hopeful expression, her resolve melted like butter on hot pancakes. "I suppose we could stop by this afternoon," she said, trying to sound casual. "If you finish all your morning reading first." Lila's cheer echoed through the cabin, and Ava couldn't help but laugh. She placed another stack of pancakes on Lila's plate, watching as her daughter drowned them in syrup. The morning light caught the happiness on Lila's face, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly, wonderfully normal. Later that afternoon, they pulled into the familiar gravel lot of Maddox Motors. The weekend brought more activity to the small town. People walking dogs, shopping at the farmer's market down the street, teenagers lounging outside the ice cream parlor. The garage's bay doors were wide open, country music drifting out along with the familiar sounds of tools and engines. Chris emerged from behind a lifted truck, his face breaking into a genuine smile when he saw them. "Well, if it isn't my favorite junior mechanic," he called out, grabbing a clean rag to wipe his hands. "Ready to build that rocket buggy?" Lila practically bounced in her wheelchair. "Yes! Can we paint flames on it? Real ones, not baby flames." "Wouldn't dream of giving you baby flames," Chris assured her with mock seriousness. He glanced at Ava, his eyes softening. "Mind if I borrow your co-pilot for some serious engineering?" Ava waved them off, settling into a comfortable chair in the shade just outside the garage. She picked up a local newspaper someone had left behind, more for something to do with her hands than actual interest in small-town news. The afternoon warmth was pleasant, and the sound of Lila's laughter mixed with Chris's patient instructions created a peaceful backdrop. Ava found herself actually reading the paper, amused by stories about missing garden gnomes and heated debates over the proper way to make sweet tea. "Now that's interesting," a voice suddenly said from nearby, making Ava look up. A middle-aged man in a polo shirt stood there, looking at her with uncomfortable intensity. She recognized him as a regular customer, Gary something, who'd been in and out of the garage all afternoon. "I'm sorry?" Ava kept her voice neutral, though her shoulders tensed. Gary leaned against a nearby post, clearly settling in for a conversation. "You just look real familiar. Were you at the Horizon Tech Summit a few years back? The one in San Francisco?" Ava's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression carefully blank. "No, I don't think so. I'm not really the tech conference type." She could feel Chris's attention shift their way, though he kept working with Lila on the cart. His movements had slowed, become more deliberate. "You sure?" Gary pressed, squinting at her. "Because you look just like that CEO who was all over the news last year. The one with the messy divorce from that venture capital guy. What was her name?" "I get that a lot," Ava cut in smoothly, years of business negotiations helping her maintain composure. "Just one of those faces, I guess. If you'll excuse me, I should check on my daughter." She stood up, folding the newspaper with precise movements. Gary finally took the hint and wandered off, but the damage was done. The peaceful bubble of the afternoon had burst, reality seeping in through the cracks. Chris caught her eye as she approached, his expression concerned but asking no questions. He just nodded toward the cart they'd been modifying. "Want to see what trouble we've gotten into?" Lila launched into an excited explanation of their progress, pointing out the new battery pack and the custom controls they'd installed. The cart now sported the beginnings of what would indeed be impressive flames, and Lila had already covered one side with space-themed stickers. But Ava's mind kept drifting to her phone, sitting dark and silent in her purse, to the growing possibility that their careful anonymity might be slipping away, to all the reasons they'd run in the first place. Back at the cabin that evening, after Lila was asleep, Ava sat at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her like a black mirror. Her fingers hovered over the power button, tension visible in every line of her body. The urge to check, to know what was waiting for her in that flood of messages and emails, was almost overwhelming. But she remembered Lila's laughter today, the easy way Chris had shown her daughter how to wire the cart's lights, the simple joy of watching them work together. She thought about the peace they'd found here, however fragile it might be. Her hand dropped away from the phone. She left it off, but Gary's words echoed in her mind, planting seeds of worry that threatened to take root. The quiet of the cabin suddenly felt less like safety and more like the calm before a storm. 2 days passed like a gentle breeze in Marlow Ridge, each moment feeling more natural than the last. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the gravel lot of Maddox Motors as Ava's SUV pulled up. Lila could barely contain her excitement, her hands drumming against her wheelchair's armrests. "Easy there, Rocket Girl," Ava said, helping Lila out of the car. "You're going to take off before we even get inside." Chris emerged from the garage, wiping his hands on a red shop rag, his face lighting up at the sight of them. He had that same easy smile he always wore around Lila, but today there was something extra in his expression, a glimmer of pride and anticipation. "Ready for your upgrade?" he asked Lila, crouching down to her level. Lila's eyes widened. "You finished it?" "Sure did. Worked on it after hours." Chris reached behind her chair and flipped open a small panel he'd installed on the armrest. "Now, this here's your command center." Ava moved closer, curiosity getting the better of her. What had started as a simple repair had evolved into something else entirely. The panel housed several toggle switches, each one clearly labeled with carefully printed text. "This one's for your running lights," Chris explained, helping Lila flip the first switch. Small LED strips along the sides of her wheelchair came to life with a soft blue glow. "And this one here." He guided her hand to another switch. "That's your emergency beacon." A small red light on the back of the chair began to pulse steadily. Lila squealed with delight. "You didn't have to do all this," Ava said softly, but her voice carried warmth instead of her usual guardedness. Chris shrugged, but his eyes met hers with quiet intensity. "Wanted to. Every rocket ship needs proper controls, right? And this one?" Lila pointed to a larger switch protected by a clear plastic cover. "Ah, that's the special one." Chris flipped open the cover with theatrical flair. "That's your turbo boost." When Lila threw the switch, small strips of LED lights raced down the sides of her chair in a pattern that made it look like she was accelerating through space. The effect was simple, but magical, and Lila's laughter echoed off the garage walls. "Now you're a real mission commander," Chris said, standing up and giving her a playful salute. Ava couldn't help but laugh along with them. The joy in Lila's face was pure and unfiltered, something she hadn't seen enough of lately. Chris caught her eye and smiled, a private moment of shared happiness passing between them. The peaceful afternoon shattered with a high-pitched buzzing sound from above. At first, it was just background noise, easy to dismiss as a passing insect. But the sound grew more insistent, hovering directly overhead. Ava's laughter died in her throat as she looked up. The drone was sleek and black, its camera lens glinting in the sunlight as it maintained a steady position above the garage. The sound of its rotors seemed to drill into her skull, a mechanical reminder of everything she'd been trying to escape. Chris's reaction was instant and fierce. In one fluid motion, he snatched up a heavy wrench from his toolbox and hurled it skyward. His aim was perfect, the result of years handling bikes and tools with precision. The wrench connected with the drone's body with a satisfying crack, sending the device spiraling into the gravel lot. That wasn't no birdwatcher, Chris growled, stalking over to the downed drone. His usual gentle demeanor had vanished, replaced by something harder and more protective. Ava's face had transformed too. The warmth and openness of moments before disappeared behind a mask of cold calculation. She recognized the drone's model, top of the line, favored by professional photographers and paparazzi. This wasn't some local hobbyist. "Lila, honey, we need to go inside," she said, her voice steady but tight. The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. The photo hit social media first. Ava Lockhart, the tech industry's most talked about CEO, laughing outside a small-town garage with her daughter and an unidentified mechanic. The headline spread like wildfire. Runaway billionaire Ava Lockhart spotted in small-town garage with mystery mechanic. By sunset, Marlow Ridge was under siege. News vans clogged the narrow main street. Reporters ambushed local shop owners, shoving microphones in their faces and demanding details about the town's famous new resident. The diner owner was offered thousands for any information about Ava's breakfast orders. The grocery store clerk was hounded about her shopping habits. At the cabin, Ava paced like a caged animal, watching through the windows as cars slowly cruised past. Camera flashes punctuated the growing darkness. Lila sat quietly in her chair, the cheerful LED lights now turned off, her small face worried as she watched her mother. The knock at the door made them both jump. Reporters had been trying all evening, but this knock was different. 3 sharp raps, decisive and familiar. Ava checked the peephole and quickly opened the door. Chris stood there, his expression dark with anger and concern. He stepped inside, careful to block the view from any watching cameras. "You should have told me who you were," he said without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. "I could have been better prepared for this. Could have protected you both better." "I'm sorry," Ava started, but the words felt inadequate. "I didn't think." "No time for that now," Chris cut her off, but his eyes softened slightly as he looked at Lila. "Pack what you need. You and Lila are coming with me." The sky was still ink black when Chris's old Ford pickup rumbled down the cabin's gravel driveway. He killed the headlights, letting the truck coast the final few yards. Ava sat rigid in the passenger seat, while Lila dozed in the extended cab, wrapped in her favorite space-themed blanket. 5 minutes, Chris whispered, helping Ava gather their essential bags. "Leave anything we can replace." They worked in silence, loading only what they couldn't do without. Lila's medications, some clothes, her modified wheelchair. The rest would have to stay behind. Chris had insisted they take his truck rather than Ava's SUV, knowing the press would be watching for it. The eastern sky hadn't even begun to lighten when they pulled away. Chris navigated the back roads like someone who'd memorized every turn and pothole. Instead of taking the main highway, he guided the truck deeper into the mountains, following unmarked Forest Service roads that twisted through dense pine forests. Lila woke as the sun began to peek through the trees. "Where are we going?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Somewhere special," Chris answered, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. "A place I built myself." The road narrowed to little more than a trail, branches scraping against the truck's sides. After what felt like hours of careful navigation, Chris turned onto an almost invisible path that wound through a stand of ancient hemlocks. "There she is," he said softly as they emerged into a small clearing. The cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, its weathered wood blending naturally with the surrounding forest. It wasn't large, but it had been built with obvious care, each log carefully fitted, the metal roof aged to a subtle patina that didn't catch the light. A covered porch wrapped around two sides, and a stack of split firewood stood neatly arranged against the wall. "You built this?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris nodded, helping Lila into her chair. "After Tommy, my brother, passed. Needed somewhere to put my hands and head to work." The inside of the cabin was simple but thoughtfully arranged. The main room held a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and a small kitchen area. Two doors led to what Ava assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though it clearly hadn't been used in some time. "It's like a spaceship hideout," Lila declared, exploring the room with excitement. Her earlier worry seemed to fade in the face of this new adventure. As the day progressed, the tension in Ava's shoulders began to ease. There was something about this place, the absolute quiet, broken only by bird calls and wind in the trees, that made their problems feel distant. Chris kept Lila entertained, teaching her how to build a proper campfire in the stone ring he'd constructed near the porch. "The trick is getting the right mix," he explained, showing her how to arrange the kindling. "Too much big stuff, it won't catch. Too little, it burns out quick." Ava watched from the porch, wrapped in a borrowed flannel shirt against the mountain evening chill. The sight of her daughter laughing as she carefully placed sticks in the growing flame made her throat tight with emotion. When night fell, Chris produced a bag of marshmallows from somewhere in the cabin. Lila's eyes lit up as he taught her the proper technique for achieving the perfect golden brown toast. "The secret," he said with mock seriousness, "is patience. Rush it, and you get a torch instead of a treat." After Lila had eaten her fill of s'mores and begun to yawn, Ava helped her get ready for bed in the cabin's smaller room. The girl fell asleep almost instantly, clutching her astronaut plush, her face peaceful in the soft light of her chair's LED strips. Ava returned to find Chris adding wood to the fire. He looked up as she approached, offering her a mug of something warm that smelled like cinnamon and whiskey. She accepted it gratefully, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs he'd positioned near the flames. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, comfortable and close. Maybe it was the drink, or the fire, or just the absolute separation from her normal world, but Ava found herself talking, really talking, for the first time in years. "Everything became about the image," she said, staring into the flames. "The perfect power couple, the inspirational success story. Even our marriage was just another product to market." She took a slow sip from her mug. "I didn't realize how much of myself I'd lost until I found out he'd been using company funds to finance his affairs. Multiple affairs. All while telling the press how we were relationship goals." Chris listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful in the firelight. When she finally fell silent, he spoke quietly about his own loss. The accident that took his brother, the guilt of surviving, the long journey back to finding meaning in life. "Tommy was always the better writer," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "But he followed my lead that day. I picked the trail. I set the pace." He shook his head. "Took me years to understand that honoring his memory meant living, not just surviving." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. Ava found herself studying Chris's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the gentle way he spoke about hard things. When he turned to meet her gaze, the air seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Neither could say who moved first, but suddenly they were sharing the same breath, their lips meeting in a kiss that started gentle but carried an undertone of desperate need. Chris's hand came up to cup her cheek, calloused fingers impossibly tender against her skin. Ava's heart thundered in her chest as she leaned into him, tasting wood smoke and whiskey and something uniquely him. She broke away first, though it felt like tearing herself in half to do so. "This feels dangerous," she whispered, her voice shaky. Chris's thumb traced her cheekbone, his eyes serious in the firelight. "So does holding your breath forever." Inside the cabin, they could hear Lila shifting in her sleep, making the quiet sounds of peaceful dreams. The fire popped and settled, sending up a fresh spiral of sparks. Sitting there in the darkness, Ava felt something shift inside her, like broken pieces finally finding their matching edges, beginning the slow process of becoming whole again. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows, casting warm patches across the wooden floor. The smell of coffee and pancakes filled the small space as Chris showed Lila how to flip them just right with a quick wrist snap. She sat in her wheelchair at the counter, tongue poking out in concentration as she attempted to copy his technique. Ava leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore one of Chris's old flannels over her own clothes. The sight of them together, Chris's patient instruction, Lila's determined expression, made her heart ache in a way that was both sweet and painful. "Mom, look!" Lila called out as she managed a wobbly but successful flip. "I did it!" "Perfect form, Rocket," Chris praised, ruffling her hair. He glanced up at Ava, his eyes soft with something that made her breath catch. After breakfast, Lila discovered a stack of old moving blankets in one of the storage boxes. Her eyes lit up with possibility. "Can I build a fort?" Chris immediately started pulling empty wooden crates from the shed, positioning them carefully to create a framework. "Every space station needs a solid foundation," he explained, helping Lila direct the construction. Together, they transformed a corner of the main room into an elaborate structure, complete with a control panel made from cardboard and bottle caps. Chris even found some old battery-operated Christmas lights to string across the top, creating a starry effect inside the fort. Ava helped where she could, but mostly she found herself watching them work. The easy way they communicated, finishing each other's sentences. The gentle way Chris lifted Lila when she needed to reach higher spots. The pure joy on her daughter's face. Something Ava hadn't seen enough of lately. Throughout the day, Chris and Ava moved around each other in a dance of almost touches and lingering looks. His hand would brush her lower back as he passed. She'd let her fingers trail across his shoulder while handing him tools. Each contact sent electricity through her skin, making her increasingly aware of his presence. During lunch, they sat close enough that their knees touched under the table. The simple contact felt more intimate than any fancy dinner she'd ever had. Chris told stories about his early days learning mechanics, making Lila laugh with tales of his mistakes. Ava found herself imagining more days like this, quiet, simple, filled with laughter and purpose. But reality had a way of intruding. While Chris and Lila were engaged in an intense game of go fish in the fort, Ava slipped outside. She walked into the woods until she was sure she was out of sight, then pulled out her phone. Her hands shook slightly as she turned it on. The notifications flooded in immediately. 117 missed calls, 243 text messages. Yenbatu wonbadi emailgal. Her throat tightened as she scrolled through them. Her legal team was frantic. The board was in upheaval. There was a motion on the table. If she didn't return within 48 hours, they would vote to remove her as CEO. Everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed for, hanging by a thread. She deleted message after message, her jaw clenched tight, but one made her pause. Dr. Matthews, Lila's specialist. A reminder about an upcoming procedure they'd scheduled months ago. Something they couldn't postpone. Ava turned the phone off and pressed it against her forehead, trying to steady her breathing. The forest around her seemed to mock her temporary peace with its permanence. That evening, Chris grilled steaks on the fire pit while Ava prepared a salad inside. Lila supervised from her fort, occasionally emerging to offer important suggestions about seasoning. As they ate under the darkening sky, Chris cleared his throat. "Been thinking about something," he said, glancing between Ava and Lila. "What if we turned part of the garage into a workshop space? For kids. Call it Rocket Garage. Lila's eyes went wide. Really? Chris nodded, warming to the topic. Teach basic mechanics, safety, maybe even some engineering principles. Help kids build things, understand how stuff works. He looked at Ava. Every kid deserves to feel like they can create something amazing. Ava felt tears welling up in her eyes. The simple beauty of his vision, the way he naturally included Lila in his future plans. It was everything she'd ever wanted for her daughter, and everything she couldn't stay for. She blinked rapidly, forcing a smile. That sounds wonderful, she managed, but couldn't meet his eyes. Later, after Lila had fallen asleep in her fort, they couldn't bear to make her move to the bedroom. Ava sat alone on the porch. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the black sky. She heard Chris's footsteps behind her but didn't turn around. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. Something in his tone broke her careful control. "I never meant to stay this long," she blurted out, the words feeling like glass in her throat. "I was only supposed to breathe for a week." The silence that followed was deafening. When she finally turned to look at him, the hurt in his eyes made her want to take back every word. Chris took a step backward, his face shuddering closed. "You fixed my shop," he said, his voice rough. "My life. My kid's world." He paused, and when he spoke again, the words came out like stones. "But I was just your vacation?" Ava opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she say? That she'd fallen in love with this life? That she wished she could stay? That reality was calling and she couldn't ignore it forever? The damage was done. In the silence between them, something beautiful and fragile shattered. The morning dawned gray and heavy, matching the mood inside the cabin. Breakfast consisted of cold cereal and coffee, with only the sound of spoons clinking against bowls breaking the silence. Lila sat in her wheelchair at the table, her eyes moving between her mother and Chris, her usual chatter notably absent. She pushed her cereal around the bowl, taking small bites without enthusiasm. Ava moved through the cabin like a ghost, carefully folding clothes and packing them into their bags. Her movements were deliberate and slow, as if each item she packed was made of glass. Every now and then she'd pause, holding something of Lila's or one of the few possessions they'd accumulated during their stay. A pine cone collection, a drawing of the cabin, the modified switches Chris had given them. Each pause felt like a small goodbye. Outside, Chris hunched over an old generator, his tools spread out around him on a worn tarp. The mechanical work was familiar, something he could lose himself in without thinking about the weight pressing down on his chest. He'd taken the generator apart and put it back together twice now, though there was nothing really wrong with it. The repetitive motion of checking connections and tightening bolts gave his hands something to do while his mind raced. Through the cabin window, he caught glimpses of Ava moving back and forth. Each time, he forced his attention back to the generator, pretending not to notice. But his hands betrayed him, dropping tools more than once, his usual steady grip compromised by the tremor he couldn't quite control. Lila wheeled herself to the window several times, watching Chris work. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, understanding in her young face that sometimes words only made things harder. The morning stretched on, feeling both too long and too short. Ava gathered their belongings into neat piles by the door, each stack representing another step toward leaving. She found herself moving things from one pile to another, reorganizing without purpose, trying to delay the inevitable. When it came time to load the truck, the air felt thick with unspoken words. Chris carried their bags out one by one, his movements mechanical, his jaw set in a tight line. Ava followed with smaller items, careful to maintain distance between them as they worked. Lila sat in her wheelchair near the truck, clutching her stuffed astronaut tightly. She watched the adults move around each other like dancers in a sad ballet, neither looking directly at the other. Finally, when the last bag was loaded, She reached out and tugged at Chris's sleeve. "Will Rocket still be welcome here?" Her voice was small but clear in the morning quiet. Chris's face crumpled slightly as he turned to her. Without hesitation, he knelt down beside her wheelchair, pulling her into a tight hug. His shoulders shook slightly, but no sound came out. He pressed his face into her hair, unable to form words around the lump in his throat. From the porch, Ava watched the embrace, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand, but more followed. The sight of Chris holding her daughter, this man who had brought so much light into their lives in such a short time, made her heart feel like it was being squeezed in a vice. After a long moment, Chris helped Lila into the truck, making sure she was secure before closing the door. He walked around to the driver's side, his boots crunching on the gravel, each step seeming to require extra effort. The drive back to town was filled with a heavy silence. Lila stared out the window, her hand pressed against the glass as if trying to memorize the passing trees. Ava sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Chris kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The familiar shapes of town began to appear. The general store, the post office, the turnoff to Maddox Motors. Each landmark felt like another goodbye, another ending they hadn't planned for. When they pulled up to the rental cabin, Chris helped unload their bags without a word. He worked efficiently, stacking everything on the small porch while Ava helped Lila inside. The morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the yard. Ava stood by the cabin door, watching as Chris set down the last bag. He straightened up slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans, still not meeting her eyes. "Thank you." Ava's voice caught slightly. She swallowed hard and tried again. "Thank you for everything." Chris gave a short nod, his face unreadable. Without looking back, he turned and walked away, his shoulders set in a straight line. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust as he walked, growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared around the bend. That evening, Ava sat at the small kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The screen glowed with familiar emails and documents, board meeting minutes, quarterly reports, press statements waiting for her approval. Her corporate life hung there in pixels and professional language, ready to reclaim her. Her team had already drafted her return statement. They'd planned a series of interviews to explain her absence, scheduled meetings to reassure investors. Everything was laid out in neat bullet points, waiting for her to step back into her role as CEO. But her mind kept drifting to the garage, the smell of oil and metal, the sound of tools clinking against concrete, Chris's patient voice explaining mechanics to Lila. Her heart felt anchored there, even as her brain told her it was time to go. Lila wheeled herself quietly into the kitchen, watching her mother stare at the screen. Without a word, she slipped a folded piece of paper into Ava's bag that sat beside the table. "I forgot to say goodbye," she whispered, before turning and heading back to her room, leaving Ava alone with her thoughts and the quiet hum of the laptop. The garage felt different now. Chris moved through his daily routine like always, opening up shop at dawn, checking appointments, ordering parts. But something was missing. The space echoed differently, as if the walls themselves missed the sound of Lila's laughter and the cheerful beeping of her modified wheelchair horn. He caught himself glancing at the empty corner where Lila's workbench used to be. They'd set it up together, adjusting the height just right for her wheelchair. Now there was just a clean patch of concrete where the bench had stood, like a scar on the garage floor. Customers came and went, their vehicles requiring the same repairs they always had. Chris fixed transmissions, changed oil, and replaced timing belts with his usual precision. But his usual easy banter felt forced, his smiles not quite reaching his eyes. Even Gary, his most talkative regular, noticed the change. "You ain't been yourself lately," Gary mentioned one afternoon, watching Chris work under the hood of his pickup. "Missing those visitors of yours, aren't you?" Chris just grunted and tightened a bolt with more force than necessary. The wrench slipped, and he scraped his knuckles against the engine block. The sharp sting of pain was almost welcome. It gave him something else to focus on. Every morning, he'd walk past the shelf where they'd stored Lila's space tools. A collection of regular tools they'd painted with glow-in-the-dark stars and rocket ships. He'd left them exactly where they were, unable to bring himself to move them. The sight of them made his chest tight, but he couldn't bear to put them away. A week crawled by like this, each day bleeding into the next. The summer heat bore down on the garage, making the air inside thick and heavy. Chris worked with the doors open, hoping for a breeze, but the air remained still and stagnant, much like his thoughts. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Chris decided to clean his toolbox, something he'd been putting off for weeks. He pulled out drawers full of scattered tools, wiping down each one methodically. The familiar task should have been soothing, but every tool seemed to hold a memory. The socket wrench he'd used to fix Lila's wheelchair, the pliers they'd used together to create her control panel. As he pulled out the bottom drawer, something fluttered to the floor. A napkin, creased and slightly oil-stained, with familiar crayon markings. His heart stumbled as he picked it up, recognizing Lila's careful handwriting. "You fixed my chair. Can you fix my mom's heart?" Chris sank onto his work stool, the napkin trembling slightly in his grease-stained hands. He read the words over and over, each time feeling them cut deeper. The simple honesty of a child's question laid bare everything he'd been trying not to feel. For a long time, he just sat there, holding that wrinkled napkin like it was made of glass. The afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Finally, he stood up, walked to the sink, and carefully washed his hands clean of grease and oil. Without stopping to second-guess himself, he grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. He scribbled a quick "closed" sign and taped it to the garage door. The drive to the city would take hours, but he didn't care. He had to go. The city rose up before him like a wall of glass and steel, so different from the quiet mountains of Marlow Ridge. Chris navigated through the unfamiliar streets, following the directions to the tech conference center he'd found online. His truck looked out of place among the sleek cars filling the parking structure. Inside the conference center, Chris felt even more out of place. His work boots and plain clothes stood out among the suits and professional attire of the attendees. But he pressed on, following the signs to the main presentation hall. The room was packed, but he found a spot near the back where he could see the stage. When Ava walked out to the podium, his breath caught in his throat. She looked exactly as he remembered, yet completely different. Her business suit was impeccable, her presence commanding. But there was something in her eyes, a tiredness that makeup couldn't quite hide. She began her speech about innovation and leadership, her voice strong and clear. But when she reached a section about the personal cost of success, her words took on a different tone. "We talk about the price of ambition," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "But sometimes the highest price isn't paid in dollars or stock options. Sometimes it's paid in moments we can never get back." Chris watched her hands tighten on the podium, noticed the way she swallowed hard before continuing. He saw what others in the audience probably missed, the slight tremor in her fingers, the moment she closed her eyes just a fraction too long between sentences. As the crowd applauded at the end of her speech, Chris turned and made his way to the exit. He'd seen what he needed to see. She belonged to this world of glass and steel, of innovation and progress. His presence would only complicate things, throw her life into chaos again. But he couldn't leave without saying something. Making his way to the hotel lobby where he knew she was staying, he found a quiet moment when the reception desk was empty. He pulled out a piece of paper, not a napkin this time, but a page torn from his repair manual. With careful strokes, he wrote his message. "I didn't fix your heart. You fixed mine. If you want to try again, I'm back at the garage." He slipped into the business center, found her laptop bag among the others, recognizing it from her days at the garage. and carefully tucked the note between the keys. Then he left, walking back through the gleaming lobby and out into the evening air. Later that night, as Ava settled into her hotel room and opened her laptop to check her emails, the folded paper fell onto her keyboard. Her hands shook as she opened it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Morning sunlight filtered through Maddox Motors' dusty windows as Chris wrestled with a stubborn bolt under a beaten-up Chevy. A familiar horn blast startled him, making him bang his head against the undercarriage. Rolling out, he saw Lila in her wheelchair wearing oversized aviator goggles, grinning widely with her hand on the horn. Behind her stood Ava in jeans and a t-shirt, holding coffee, her smile uncertain. Chris rose, wiping greasy hands on his pants. Ava approached and took his hand, asking softly, "You still hiring rocket pilots?" Lila zoomed past them. "We came back to fix the future," she announced joyfully. Chris laughed deeply, the sound breaking free after a week's absence. They fell into familiar rhythms. Chris showing Lila her star-decorated tools, Ava watching from her usual spot. Their hands brushed throughout the day, each touch feeling both electric and natural. Chris revealed new Rocket 2.0 decals on Lila's chair and later hung a sign he'd painted, "Rocket Garage, powered by heart and horsepower." As evening fell, they sat on the concrete steps watching stars appear. Lila between them, Chris's arm resting comfortably behind Ava. They were an unlikely trio, a mechanic, a tech titan, and a wheelchair-bound girl with an astronaut's spirit, a family built by choice, not blood. If you enjoyed the story of Ava and Chris, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.